Hello, welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. I'm back on Fleet Street again today. Now this is an area that I have briefly covered before in a video, but I felt it was a little bit half-hearted. I only came to 2 pubs on Fleet Street as part of this wider area, and it's such a concentration of historic pubs, Fleet Street, and such an interesting area that I felt like it needed revisiting. Pub number 1 and a hostelry of some antiquity that probably needs no introduction, the Old Cheshire Cheese. Cheers from the cosy corner at the Old Cheshire Cheese. I'm in the chop room. I'm actually here for lunch. A huge amount has been written about this pub, and it's a little bit hard to separate the fact from the hearsay. Most sources cite it as being originally established in 1538. I'm not sure there is any written evidence of that, and then rebuilt in 1667. The latter fact seems relatively credible because even the Historic England listing for the building describes the building as being 17th century. Whole books have been written about this pub. There is a fascinating tome called the Book of the Cheese, written by Thomas Wilson Reed. Its most famous former regular is of course Dr. Johnson, Samuel Johnson, although it's interesting to note that none of his writings ever referred to the pub directly by name, but Dr. Johnson did live incredibly close by in Gough Square. It's just metres away from the Cheshire Cheese, and it seems almost impossible that he wouldn't have at any point visited here. The earliest newspaper record I could find mentioning it with a clear evidence of the location is from 1796. In the 19th century, it was particularly famous for the pudding, and as Cyrus Redding writes in 1858, it's served on Wednesdays and Saturdays at 1:30 and 6 o'clock, and it is a formidable looking object, as large more or less as the dome of St. Paul's. That pudding is stuffed with steak, kidney, oysters, mushrooms and larks. The pub is listed on Camera's Pub Heritage site. They cite particularly the 2 rooms on the ground floor as being of the most historic interest and probably with the most continuity of the interior. So that's the small bar off to the right hand side as you enter. It has this beautiful open fire today, and the chop room on the left hand side. At the entrance to the bar room there is still a sign saying gentlemen only served in this bar, which of course is not paid any attention to these days, and there's also a hatch leading through to the bar that says waiter service only. The Book of Cheese cites the left-hand room as you enter as the room that was most frequented by Johnson and friends, and particularly there is a table over to the right-hand side of that room, has some plaques on the wall showing where Dr. Johnson would have sat. And there's also interestingly a plaque saying where Charles Dickens sat. He mentioned this pub, perhaps not by name, in his book A Tale of Two Cities. In the bar room there is a portrait of a former waiter at the Cheshire Cheese by the name of William Simpson. He commenced work here in 1829 and had a long, venerable career, presumably. Really is quite a special sense in this pub. You know, we can quibble about the historical accuracy of whether or not Dr. Johnson was here, but the front bar, particularly the main tiny bar room as you go in on the right hand side, it looks like may well have original 17th century panelling on the interior, and to find us any kind of remnant at all of a 17th century interior in a pub in London is practically unheard of. It has really contributes a very special atmosphere to the Cheshire Cheese that you really struggle to find anywhere else in London. Sources including Betty Crocker's cookbook cite that Ben Jonson, not to be confused with Dr. Johnson, ate Welsh rarebit here in the Old Cheshire Cheese, although this account is somewhat contested. It also mentions that Charles Dickens had the same dish here, which seems more credible. Either way, this is still on the menu today, and that's what I had for my starter of my lunch. We should talk a bit about some of the other spaces here at the Cheshire Cheese. So in addition to the probably best regarded 2 rooms, there's also a more modern extension bar, and then on the upper floors additional rooms which today were closed off. Also quite a sprawling cellar complex. I think I've seen it written somewhere that these were possibly at some point the vaults of a Carmelite monastery going back to the 13th century or something. I'm not sure if that's backed up with any written history at least, but they do have a sort of Gothic feel to the arches therein. It's quite an interesting atmospheric space in its own right. This is an etching called Toddy at the Cheshire Cheese by William Henry Boucher from 1896. The amazing thing about it is you can still see much of the interior that's depicted here today pretty much unchanged, including that cutlery cabinet there, and looking towards the fireplace and the windows now. I think presumably there would have been a courtyard there at some point. So there we have the Old Cheshire Cheese Wine Office Court just off Fleet Street. It does have a frontage onto Fleet Street as well. It's a Sam Smith's pub. Today I was having their Old Brewery Bitter. I think a pint of that currently comes in at £6. They're no longer the bargain basement brewer for London that they used to be, but it was a spectacular time in there, really sort of quite magical, and I'm sort of almost reluctant to do the other 4 pubs on today's itinerary, but perhaps wouldn't be much of a video if it was just the Cheshire Cheese and then home. So onwards. Pub number 2, the Punch Tavern. Cheers from the Punch Tavern. Sorry about the background music. Even here in the entrance corridor, which is sort of semi-outside, I've decided to re-record the audio from this bit at home. I don't really enjoy doing that. I like having the background noise of the pub, but when it's just music like that, it doesn't really work and end up with a copyright strike. Anyway, the earliest newspaper record I could find for this pub was from 1790, and that tells of how part of Fleet Street, including the pub at that time, burnt down. Back in those days, it was known as the Crown and Sugar Loaf, and it was renamed in the 1840s to the Punch Tavern due to its association with the officers of the nearby Punch magazine. Punch magazine ran all the way from the 1840s to the 1990s. I think it was then briefly revived for a few years afterwards, but is again now a defunct publication. It's Punch magazine that we have to thank for the word cartoon as a series of humorous or satirical drawings in printed form. In the 1840s, just prior to the pub changing its name, the landlord at the time got into trouble for blurring the conditions of his licence and was in fact selling ale via the shop unit just round the corner, which at the time was called the Royal Sovereign Luncheon House, and we will come back to that later. Much of the frontage and the interior that we see today dates to the 1890s, and probably the most striking feature is this entrance corridor. It has these very decorative coloured faience tiles, and they're interspersed with mirrors, possibly not original. And then towards the end of the corridor, just before the entrance to the pub proper, there is a portrait of Mr. Punch facing a portrait of Mrs. Judy. Inside the pub proper, the barback likely dates to the 1890s, and there's also a very impressive skylight overhead in the area between the bar counter and the entrance from that elaborate entrance corridor, and that may well also date to the 1890s. It's a good way of providing light into a space which otherwise doesn't have any windows. There was also quite a nice overmantel sort of piece of joinery over the fireplace there. Not sure if that was original, but I did think it looked quite decorative and interesting. Other than that, most of the interior is a bit more modern, and it has become a little bit of a food-leaning pub. The What Pub website from Camera, in fact, states that you're pretty much expected to eat there at lunchtimes. That wasn't the case on my visit, perhaps because it was January and they just weren't busy and there was no problem just going in and ordering a beer. So it's a mixed bag, the Punch Tavern. I think on the plus side, the beer is surprisingly cheap, £2.60 for a half of Timothy Taylor, making it cheaper than the Sam Smith's pub across the road. Some elements of the interior are really beautiful. I love that entrance corridor. For me, it's a bit spoiled by the background music. I think if they could at least give you a bit of reprieve from that in that entrance corridor, you could have just enjoyed that in peace and quiet. I think that would have made it a bit nicer, but definitely worth popping in at least for a quick pint. In what has to be one of the shortest hops I think I've ever done on this channel between two pubs, Punch Tavern's just over there. Pub number 3, the Crown and Sugar Loaf, is practically adjoining, and we'll talk a bit more about their shared history in there. So I did go into the Crown and Sugar Loaf, have a quick half. It has to be one of London's smallest pubs. It's a real gem of a pub, actually, but tiny on the interior, and wonderfully, being a Sam Smith's pub, no music or anything, nice and quiet. So there were just sort of 4 other customers in there, and for me to be talking to my little box with my imaginary friends in on a stick would be a bit disruptive, I thought. So I did a blurb outside This has only come into being in its current form in 2004. As mentioned previously at the Punch Tavern, it does have this very shared history with the Punch Tavern. Whatpub.com, the camera website, reports that the freehold of the entire site, actually encompassing both the Punch round the corner and the Crown and Sugar Loaf here, is owned by Sam Smiths. At some point when some renovation work was done at the Punch Tavern, I think in the 90s, possibly 1997, a bit of extension work was done there. This was carved off to make a separate premises, separate licensed premises. Most of the fixtures and fittings we see inside are modern, but they're, I think, a really beautiful recreation of a tiny Victorian style pub in the style that's usually called a gin palace, correctly or erroneously. One feature noted by Camera's outstanding conversions and renovations site, and that might be original, is the plasterwork on the ceiling. Its exact history is a little murky and a little hard to unpick. I'm sure I had seen years ago some records that it had actually been used as a bar as part of the Punch Tavern, but I couldn't more recently find any evidence of that. The only evidence I could find is that record of the Royal Sovereign luncheon house, was it, back well into the 19th century, that was effectively a sandwich shop that on the sly the owner of the Crown and Sugar Loaf, as it was then, which we now know as the premises of the Punch Tavern, was selling ale through a sort of back door into there, and then got into trouble with the licensing authorities. Looking at some old photos from the London Picture Archive from 1971, looks to me that the frontage, at least elements of it, are unchanged, at least since then. Those fan lights that you can see over the windows, perhaps currently behind me, were there, and this row of pillars, which could be some sort of Swedish coastal granite. There's the sort of red granite pillars that actually extend around the corner into what is now a sort of currency exchange store on the corner, which may at some point have been part of the complex of the Punch Tavern and or Crown and Sugar Loaf. Looking at old newspaper articles in the 1860s, I found mention at this address, although of course the numbering on Bride Lane may well have changed, of a business that presumably was a chemist or a pharmacist, and they were selling Dr. Locock's pulmonic wafers, which were later on written off as a form of quack medicine. We have the Old Bell Tavern there, which is probably another one that would usually be included in a lineup of Fleet Street pubs. I have visited that before in that previous video where I sort of flitted through this area, so I'm going to skip it today. The Tipperary here behind me is a pub I would very much have liked to have included on today's tour. It is a well-known Fleet Street pub, and sometimes cited as London or possibly even England's oldest Irish pub. Sadly, it has been closed since 2020 and its future looks very uncertain. I think there has been a, what is it called, a notice of possession posted since 2022, but it's looking in a pretty sorry state at the moment, I'm afraid. The notice of possession there, that is certainly not a pub that looks to me as though it's reopening anytime soon, sadly. The monument there in the middle of the road marks the former site of the Temple Bar that you can now see in, is it called Paternoster Square, next to St Paul's Cathedral. We're at one end of Fleet Street now, where it meets the Strand. Over there we run into the City of Westminster rather than the City of London, and that's the Strand. And pub number 4 is this Italianate edifice on the corner of Fleet Street and Bell Yard, the Old Bank of England. Cheers from the Old Bank of England. Now, this was until 1975 the Law Courts branch of the Bank of England. This branch opened in 1881 to facilitate links with the adjacent law courts and the Public Trustee Office. After 1975, it became a branch of a building society. I think it was the Bristol and West, until 1994 when it became a pub. Now, for most of the time that I have known this pub, it has been a fuller's pub, but I believe the freehold was actually owned by Macmullans and in 2019 McMullen's actually then resumed the management. McMullen's did a pretty major refurbishment of the pub in 2020, so it looks quite different today. I haven't been in since, and as I say, I knew it under its Fuller's era. I haven't been in since that refurbishment, and the style of the interior is really quite different from how it was. Most noticeably, the chandeliers have been replaced. These now look like a sort of a ring fitting, you can see one behind me right there, or a ring fitting with what look like sort of upturned large wine glasses pointing downwards holding the actual lights. The plasterwork on the ornate high ceilings has been retained, but the colour scheme is quite different. I think personally I slightly preferred the previous version of it, and particularly in that refurbishment, the original island bar, which of course wasn't, I would say original, it was original dating back to the 1990s. Fuller's, during their tenure, had obviously tried to recreate something like a Victorian style island bar. What we have today instead is this very modern version with kind of metal framing. The building is listed, and Historic England's listing mentions that it was built originally in 1886. Historic England described the exterior as Italianate, has those two square towers fronting onto Fleet Street. It's Portland stone above. There is a mixture of Doric and Venetian columns along that frontage. They also mention the good ironwork, presumably that's referring to the main entrance, where it has a fairly hefty pair of wrought iron gates that presumably can be closed overnight and may have been a more important feature in the days that this was a bank. It reminds me slightly of some of those Wetherspoons conversions from my previous video. It isn't a pubby pub. I mean, this obviously isn't a traditional low-hanging beams, knickknacks on the wall, nooks and crannies type of pub. It's a very different proposition. It is a grand and impressive space, and definitely some people will like it for that. It might draw a crowd that perhaps isn't interested in those more traditional pub styles. The difference between this and, for example, the Cheshire cheese that we saw at the start of this video couldn't be more stark to me. McMullen's is an interesting brewery. It's a relatively new one to me, although they apparently have 10 pubs in London. I can't think when I've knowingly been into a McMullen's pub before. They had on the hand pumps a choice between their bitter and their mild. Interestingly, the AK mild. Quite rare to see a mild, so given that opportunity I plumped for that. This came in at £2.65 for a half. One of the main reasons I wanted to include this pub on today's itinerary is that it's actually a very good segue for pub number 5, the Cock Tavern, because this in fact was the original site of the Cock Tavern, and sadly that was demolished to make way for this bank, which with some irony has then since become a pub again. Cheers. See if I can pull over a stool. Cheers from the Olde Cock Tavern. This is a pub, I will admit, I've mostly dismissed in the past. It has become sort of very much a modern chain pub, and I thought basically nothing of the original fabric of the pub really survived. There has been a pub going back to the 16th century on Fleet Street called the Cock Tavern. It is mentioned by Samuel Pepys no fewer than 9 times in his diaries in the 1660s. But the original site that he was talking to, and that most of the history associated with this pub is referring to, is across the street where the old Bank of England is now. So it was demolished, sadly, in the 1880s to build a bank. Unusually, in the 1880s, after the original site of the pub was demolished, it was actually relocated across the street here. Part of my reason for writing it off was this was just a pub that had borrowed the name of a pub that used to be across the street and really had no other claim to being any continuity of that old pub. But actually, I've chosen the location to do this bit of blurb very carefully, because behind me and immediately to the right of me are potentially 2 wonderful relics of the 17th century and the former incarnation of the Cock Tavern. So I'm sitting in the first floor bar area. There is a bay window as part of the frontage now, and just immediately beyond me, I can almost reach out and touch it were it not for the glass, is a carving of a rooster, a cock, or to use the delightfully antiquated term, a chanticleer. Chanticleer sounds sort of French to me. And this had at one time been attributed to master carver Grinling Gibbons. It's hard to know for sure if this really was the original one that formed part of the frontage of the original site of the Cock Tavern. In looking for old newspaper records of the Cock Tavern, I found some mentions that at one time this was actually stolen. So in an article in the Telegraph in 1882, it sounds as though the cock had briefly gone missing and the landlord at the time said that it was believed to have been stolen. Not completely sure how credible this is, but a few years later in 1887, possibly the same landlord or possibly the subsequent landlord reported that it had in fact been returned anonymously. So it's not impossible that there is the continuity there to say that this is the original, if it was indeed carved by Grinling Gibbons. That would put the date on it at least the sort of 1660s, latter end of, so he was born in 1648, moved to London in 1667. It could have been known to Samuel Pepys, possibly dates to slightly beyond the date of his diaries, but he of course survived until, was it the early 1700s? So if the cock or the rooster, if there is some debate about whether or not that is the original one from the late 17th century, behind me right now as I speak I have something also attributed to that master carver. This is the chimneypiece or the overmantel of the fireplace here, which originally sat in the old site of the Cock Tavern across the street and was moved here presumably in the 1880s after this new site was rebuilt. It's stone at the base and then wood carving. I think Grinling Gibbons was famous for normally working in lime. Again, this is a piece that Samuel Pepys may well have sat in front of, even though it possibly came just beyond the end of when he was writing his diaries. It's a beautiful piece of carving. Pilasters either side, almost sort of mermaid-like figures. In the middle is a face that to me is sort of somewhat reminiscent of the Green Man, that old pagan image. When rumours started to circulate in around 1868 that the end was nigh for the old site of the Cock Tavern, I found a wonderful newspaper article from that time by a writer sort of making a passionate plea for somebody to come and save this hearth behind me. Philip Norman wrote a book called London Vanished and Vanishing, capturing some of the buildings and interiors that were at risk or already gone in his lifetime, and he created this beautiful, I think, picture of the interior of the Cock Tavern, the old site across the road, the other side of Fleet Street, and that has this chimneypiece, this mantelpiece, this hearth very clearly visible. There is so much recorded about this beautiful lump of wood sitting behind me right now. And it's amazing to think today how almost forgotten about it is. Much of the interior of the modern Cock Tavern is frankly unremarkable. It's a Green King chain pub today. There isn't really very much to write home about in the interior. It's not on camera's inventory of historic pub interiors, but this small corner of the pub that nobody really seems to care about, I very easily have it all to myself, has something that I think is really quite remarkable. The current building is listed by Historic England, but they cite the date as 1912, which is slightly at odds with the removal of the site from across the road in the 1880s. So possibly there were two in quite quick succession rebuilds. It could also be London's narrowest pub. We saw one of London's smallest pubs earlier in the Crown and Sugarloaf, but this is incredibly narrow, especially if you look at it from across the street, the other side of Fleet Street. It's really sort of squeezed in between two buildings either side, and it's quite eye-catching when you see it from that angle. One further snippet of history related to the Cock Tavern that I found quite interesting is that in the 17th century they issued tokens. There was such a shortage in that era of small change, the government of the day was disinterested in providing small value coins, that local businesses started to effectively issue their own. As noted, it is a Green King pub today. This is, I think it's actually something from Portobello Brewery, one of the guest beers. They had on Autumn Red, something Autumn Fox, something Autumn Red. Feels weird now, it's January, but that's pleasant enough, it's okay. But I sort of feel like none of that matters in comparison with this spectacular object that I have behind me that has sat in pubs and has been pictured and has been written about and has been talked about and has been admired for what, 350 years. Here's to you, Samuel Pepys, and here's to you, Grinling Gibbons. Cheers. That is it for today from Fleet Street. Feels a bit like a sort of sandwich of a video of two pubs at either side that I was really quite excited about, and some filler in the middle. But I think it is a very rich theme of historic pubs, Fleet Street, and at least some corners of even the ones that may initially seem modern and perhaps a bit uninteresting still have these fascinating corners. So thank you very much for watching. I've really enjoyed that day out, and I will see you on the next one.